Well, the fundamental purpose of humanitarian assistance is to alleviate suffering, to save lives, and to establish the necessary dignity to people that has been affected by either disasters or conflicts. The humanitarian assistance is very much based in the framework that constitutes today the international humanitarian law, and in many respects comes from the origins of both the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and the Geneva Conventions, and very much based on the fundamental tenets that Henri Dunant, one of the founders of the Committee of Red Cross, stated after the Solferino battle and translated into a framework for action. The principle of humanity, of fundamental empathy with the human being to ensure that the human being is not suffering and certainly is not dying. The principles that developed later of independence and of neutrality to try to ensure that the interventions are not associated with neither any side of the conflict or that is not going to be or are not going to be discriminating in terms of the interventions, in terms of any religious, political, economic, racial belief or difference or status of the population, and the independence of the humanitarian actors. This all has shaped what we could call the credo of humanitarian action. But sometimes I think we need to reposition one fundamental value that we never call it like this. It's the value of solidarity. Solidarity has to be in the center of the humanitarian efforts. Is human beings supporting and being solidary, being empathic, being instrumental for helping others. Helping others that are particularly disadvantaged because of adversities of a disaster or a crisis. So in many respects, I think we need to humanize more the humanitarianism by bringing a dimension of solidarity. But in addition to this, I think it's time for us to reflect on the limits of humanitarian action. It is an important measure to intervene in the situations of adversity, of conflict, of disasters, of forced migration, maybe even of affected populations by epidemic outbreaks. But it is not sufficient only with the relief that is associated with humanitarian action, because we need to, on one hand, build the capacity to prevent, to be prepared for some of these catastrophes, to build the resilience for dealing with these adversities. And on the other hand, we need to build the capacity to create sustainable solutions, have institutional strengthening in the affected places or countries, and have as well capacities among the people to build their own solutions and their own responses as time goes. One of the most terrible things that we have is the arrival of huge crowds and resources for humanitarian aid. And after a few months, when either the media coverage is over or the funding is over, the disappearance of all these humanitarian actors, without an exit strategy, without a transition built to create solutions in the long term, and the abandonment and neglect of this crisis, of these situations of human suffering, creating the so-called chronic protracted emergencies, or in my view also chronic underdevelopment, that is not properly addressed, neither financially by governments and by donors and by other actors and development banks, and that sometimes takes 3, 4, 5 years in this land that is nobody's land of the recovery and the transition post-crisis, where a lot of human needs are still present, but no resources of the humanitarian action and intervention are there. And then people are abandoned in their own lack of resources and without having created sustainable solutions. In many respects, a crisis like the one we have seen recently with Ebola, it illustrates very clearly how countries that have suffered crises associated to conflict, like Liberia or Sierra Leone, were so devastated, their infrastructure was so deteriorated, their capacity of delivering healthcare was disrupted, that was impossible to cope with an outbreak of this nature and to build solutions that would be rapidly responding to the scale of need that was created. It's just an example, but we are full of examples of repeated cycles of humanitarian assistance, whether it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Darfur, in South Sudan, in the Middle East, where we keep pumping resources and deploying people to have band-aids, some solutions to the suffering, important, but not creating long-term sustainable solutions. I think we need to move much more into a paradigm of creating a peace culture, a resilience culture, a culture of sustainability by doing things that are going to create capacities in the long term and not just to rely on short-term mechanisms of aid such as humanitarian assistance.